Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to our first TOMRA Talks Roundtable. My name is Mitu Moran, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Just a short housekeeping note before we get started. After the presentation that will take around 25 minutes, we'll be taking your questions in a Q&A session. You can enter your questions on the right side of your monitor in the chat, either anonymously or with your name. Whatever you feel comfortable with is fine with us. As I just said, this is our first TOMRA Talks Roundtable, the goal of which is to provide you, as journalists, a first glimpse of new findings from TOMRA before it is launched to the general public. Today's session is focused on EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, and more specifically on 5 design elements that are required to ensure a successful EPR system. And who better to explain those 5 elements than TOMRA, who has been in the circular waste management business for 50 years and has focused on reuse, collection, sorting, and recycling to close the loop, and continues to collaborate with partners along the value chain to accelerate towards a circular economy. Joining me today are Sarah Bloomquist, Director Public Affairs for TOMRA in the US. Sarah's experience in collaborating in cross-sector partnerships offer valuable insights to using innovative technology, policy, and systems-based approaches to work towards decarbonization and a zero-waste world. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Mitu.
Also joining us is Biljana Ignatova, Vice President Public Affairs for TOMRA in the European Union. Biljana is a leading advisor on creating effective policies to accelerate the transition to a circular economy and works with various EU stakeholders to promote circular resource management and recycling practices. Welcome, Biljana.
Thank you, Mitu, and welcome to everyone joining us today.
So, Sarah, let's start with you. Could we take a step back and explain what EPR actually is?
Yes, thanks, Mitu, for that introduction. So EPR, the 3 letters at the very basic level, Extended Producer Responsibility. So what we have here is the definition from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which defines EPR as an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product is extended to the post-consumer stage of a product's life cycle. This is probably the best definition we have globally, where everyone agrees on the meaning of EPR and where it's really saying that producers take full responsibility from that beginning design stage until the end, when that material traditionally is waste, but now we're hoping it will be collected and recycled to be used again as a new product. This principle, in the meantime, it's widely used as an environmental policy approach, and it's applied to a wide range of products. For example, you might be most familiar with EPR for batteries, tires, electronics, mattresses, a lot of difficult to recycle materials. So what EPR means in practice is that producers, also known as companies or brand owners, let's say, they have to finance, and to some extent, they have to organize and be involved in the setting up of the necessary collection, sorting, and recycling infrastructure. To be effective, EPR has to be accompanied by legislation. This ensures that producers are obliged by law to cover the costs for the waste management of the packaging that they're placing on the market. And this is, of course, very important because this money can be basically used to build up well-equipped infrastructure for collection, sorting, and recycling to ensure that these materials are effectively managed. EPR, as I mentioned, it's a principle that can be implemented in different ways to adapt to different contexts and, in fact, to different types of products. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when it comes to packaging, there are 2 main types of EPR we have here on the left and the right. Deposit return systems, or DRS, also known as deposit return schemes, depending where you might live. Those are the optimum EPR systems for beverage containers. DRS is a proven global best practice to achieve high collection rates, and especially also for litter reduction for beverage containers. And for the rest of consumer packaging, there's EPR, which relies on curbside or drop-off collection, And we'll refer to this generally just as EPR or EPR for packaging throughout the presentation, also in the white paper, although we're really talking about curbside and drop-off for consumer packaging. So as I said, our focus today is on this dark blue box on the slide on the right. Oop, you're on mute, me too.
Thank you. Biliana, as you're in Europe, you've been aware of EPR for some time, and in fact, it's been around for quite some time. Can you take us through the history, where we are today, and maybe what we see coming?
Sure. Thanks, Mitu. So talking about the history, actually, if we think about it, then the traditional practice to return glass bottles or jars even to be washed, refilled and used again, then EPR is probably centuries old. But the concept as such was developed in the beginning of the 90s. It was first conceptualized by Thomas Lindqvist, a professor from Lund University in Sweden. And then it quickly became very popular amongst policymakers who started to implement EPR policies and legislation, requiring producers to take responsibility for their products and to set up and finance appropriate waste management systems. So within the first decade of its existence, mandatory EPR for packaging was in place in most of Western European countries. And then in the following decades, as you see, this expanded massively to other countries. And today EPR is present on virtually every continent, in countries ranging from emerging to established economies. So here we are using a map from Lorax to illustrate this evolution. This is the situation today, and you see different colors. The red one shows voluntary approaches to EPR, and the remaining colors show different stages of implementation for legislated EPR. And if we now look into the future, this trend of EPR implementation is only going to continue as more countries seek effective solutions to their waste problem. And if you notice here, the red color is disappearing. This means that voluntary initiatives by industry are replaced with mandatory EPR. And this is because, as Sarah explained, it provides a proven framework and results. So countries with mandatory EPR have typically higher waste management standards. They collect, sort and recycle packaging waste more effectively. So to recap here on the trends, what we see on a global level is that EPR is expanding and more countries are looking to implement EPR legislation. Especially countries with no experience with EPR, but the wish to have it, they don't know where to start and how to do things right. And even in some countries with existing EPR for some years already, implementation and results haven't always been great. So these countries are actually looking for advice and for solutions. As we know, it's important not only to have EPR, but also to get it right. And with our 50 years of experience around the globe, as Mitu mentioned, both in system design and technology, we as TOMRA, we've been able to gather experience on what works best and what is needed for EPR to work effectively. And we are ready to share our recommendations. So what we are seeing is that definitely there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Every context is different and requires special consideration, but we have identified 5 key principles that are needed for high-performing systems, regardless of the context or the stage of implementation. So every country that is setting up a new EPR system for consumer packaging or a country which is revising an existing system should align with these 5 principles that we have listed here. The principle of circularity, performance, convenience, producer responsibility, and system integrity.
Thank you, Biliana. Just before we continue to dig a little bit deeper, I know we had some technical issues at the beginning and we have some people joining late. So for those of you who are joining late, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat section on the right side of your monitor for the Q&A session that will take place after the formal presentation. Thanks. So Biljana, perhaps we could dig a little bit deeper, starting with circularity, which is a bit of a buzzword.
Yes, exactly. I agree. It is quite a buzzword. Everyone is talking about circularity, but so what do we mean by that? What do we mean by that word circularity? So that's the idea to keep the materials in the economy in a continuous loop, to preserve their quality and to ensure that they're continuously recycled for new value applications. And to achieve circularity, the policy framework is guided by the waste hierarchy. This is an internationally accepted order of priority for waste management options based on the ecological impact. So the best waste is the one which is not produced at all. So prevention and reuse should be prioritized where possible. And generally, we should also shift towards speaking about resources rather than waste. So this should evolve towards a resource hierarchy instead of waste hierarchy. But for packaging, which is already produced, which is already in circulation and reaches the end of use, then we should make sure to collect and recycle it to give it a new life. And in that sense, as a priority comes closed loop recycling, where materials are processed back to the same value application and can be recycled again and again multiple times. So we retain the initial value of the material. Then with open loop recycling, materials are processed to less demanding applications and cannot be used again for their original purpose. And then the least preferred waste treatment options are energy recovery and landfilling, where the material value is lost. We might be able to capture some energy, the energetic value, but again, the material value is lost. So these come at the bottom as the last options. And I believe we mentioned this previously. What happens with the packaging at the end of life is defined by the beginning, by how this packaging is designed in the first place. So eco-design is a key term here. And again, the waste, the resource hierarchy should serve as a guidance, meaning that the packaging should be conceived to last long, to be reusable where relevant, to integrate secondary raw materials rather than using virgin. And at the end of the day, it has to be designed to be recyclable, and the right systems need to be in place to enable that. So EPR has the potential to improve the recyclability of packaging, because in an EPR scheme, producers whose packaging is generally easier to sort and recycle have to pay lower fees into the system. And on the contrary, EPR makes non-recyclable packaging more expensive for companies to place on the market. So this is how eco-design and recyclability are incentivized through EPR. So here we have established that recycling has priority over other waste management options such as incineration and landfilling. And now it is also important to measure recycling in a meaningful way so that circularity is promoted. And how do we do that? So starting here with this first point on the top, where packaging is placed on the market, then a certain amount of that is being collected. Here, it is then sorted into different material fractions like plastics, metals, paper, etc. Then each of these fractions undergoes further treatment processes with additional cleaning, removal of labels, residues, etc. And then it is ready to go as an input to the stage where recyclates are produced. So it is at this point here in the whole chain that recycling should be measured to only account for the amount which is effectively being turned into secondary raw materials, and any contaminations and residues are excluded. And to give a perspective here, recycling used to be commonly measured just after the first sorting step. But we have seen that there are still residues and contaminations to be removed after this step, so it doesn't really convey the true performance. And in fact, it is an overestimation of the performance. So for plastics, for example, this can be around 30% above the actual performance. And this is why countries are realizing this is not correct, and they are fixing this by setting the measurement point at the correct point here.
Biljana, maybe I can just ask a quick question here. If
Sure.
I understand this correctly, by moving it to what you're calling the correct or the accurate calculation point, this is how we're really getting a true picture of circularity, right?
Yes, exactly, because we are ensuring that all contaminations, all residues, all things that will not be effectively recycled, these are not accounted in the recycling rate. And for instance, in the European Union, the latest revision of the waste legislation has specifically removed the possibility for countries to count recycling after this first sorting step, and has officially set the calculation point as we have described it.
Okay, that sounds reasonable, and it sounds like we're moving in the right direction. Let's maybe move on to the second principle that you mentioned, that's performance. How can EPR drive performance?
Thanks, me too. That's a great question, and performance definitely is a key principle here in how we're measuring the outcomes of EPR, really. So performance is really driven when there are clear and ambitious targets set in the legislation, and this is for a well-defined scope of packaging, as well as outlined roles and responsibilities for all relevant parties, making sure that those roles, responsibilities are clear. Thank you. Sorry, we have a little delay in the slides. So targets, here's a snapshot of what we mean by targets. EPR policies, they typically include targets because they enable the assessment and the measurement of the performance. And they also give that certainty that's needed to make investments into the system for improving it. Targets, I think a good way to think of them really is as KPIs or key performance indicators for EPR. And so to achieve circular packaging, policies need to include targets for both recycling and also for recycled content. Recycling targets measured, as we've just seen, as Biljana explained, they need to ensure the availability of high quality secondary raw materials. But we also need to make sure that these are effectively used to replace virgin materials in new products. And this is where recycled content targets really are key. And what we mean when we're saying recycled content, this is referring to the amount of the recycled material that is used in a product or packaging. So the higher the amount of recycled content that's used, the more effectively we're really closing the loop on materials and on that packaging. So on one side where we have recycling targets, those are really driving the supply side, bringing more material into the system. Recycled content targets on the other side are driving the demand side. So the two of these really work in concert together to balance out the economics of recycling. And this amount is critical for recycled content targets specifically because it decreases the demand for the extraction and the production of virgin materials. It also proves that the systems are functioning well and that they're able to meet high quality specifications for new products. So to sum that up a bit, recycling targets, they also need to be differentiated per material. We don't want them all just one big group together. We need a little bit of granularity, which can improve over time. They also need to be rather ambitious so that change in the system is really being driven, but they also need to be attainable. So this is where we have to find that balance that we're setting producers up for success while also driving change in the system. So for that, they should be staggered over time that will drive the technological innovation. It supports infrastructure development, and it also, really importantly here, gives industry time to adapt and to scale up. Next.
So this is all good and well, Sarah, but actually we have to make it easy, I guess, for the consumers.
We do. And so when we talk about convenience here, what we are referring to really is convenience from the point of view of the consumer or the public, because you can't have an effective system if the public doesn't participate. At the end of the day, they're the ones purchasing, and we need them to get this material back into the system. So in order for them to participate, what we really need are systems that have convenient access and that they're intuitive to use. So yes, the general public, they're essential in a high-performing EPR system. In order to meet those recycling targets that we were just speaking of and to bring in that supply, the participation of the public or the consumer is key. The two main aspects, universal access and easy to use. What EPR does really is it provides convenience by making it accessible and easy to dispose of that packaging waste correctly. So we can think of access as how far do I need to travel? Where is the system located? Where is the bin? Is it right in front of my house? Is it in the public? Do I have to drive? And of course, the easier that access is, the greater the participation. And then the system itself, ease of use. How easy is it to use? How much effort do I have to put into it to understand it? Do I have to separate into many different bins or just one or two? Or, what are the different options there for setting up the system? Whichever collection setup is implemented, however, we also really need to make sure that there's communication and awareness campaigns. Without those, there's no way the public will know, if the system has changed. We have packaging materials change all the time, so they need to be made aware when these systems change so that they can participate properly, which people really want to do. So all of these aspects, these really drive participation. But the ease of use and the communication, those two are really key in reducing contamination specifically and ensuring that we're getting a high quantity of material collected with high quality that can go into the new products and meet those recycled content targets that we were discussing.
Okay, so now we've made it easy for the consumer, or we're trying to, but how exactly do we get this set up?
Yes, me too. Then we come to the next principle of producer responsibility. And first, maybe to start, what is meant by the producer, and that's typically the brand owner, so the manufacturer of the packaged product, so the company whose logo or brand will appear with big colorful letters on the package. But also in some cases, the producer could be the packaging manufacturer and the retailer as well for their private label brands. And we have seen that according to the EPR principle, producers cover the costs for the packaging from the design stage throughout the end of life stages. And they do that through what is known as a producer responsibility organization, or a PRO, which is here shown as a central element to the whole system. So producers contribute financially to the PRO by paying EPR fees according to the type and amounts of packaging placed on the market. And then the PRO uses this money to finance activities which are needed to achieve the targets set in legislation, such as collection, sorting, recycling of the packaging waste. And the PRO also typically provides guidance to producers on eco-design, so how to design their packaging properly so that it fits also with existing infrastructure. And the PRO also collaborates with local authorities, with municipalities, to provide information to the citizens. So to inform them about what Sarah was explaining, what the system looks like and what is expected from them. When setting up an EPR scheme, the legislator should clearly define what costs exactly the producers need to cover. And the international standard here is that at minimum the costs for collection, sorting and recycling should be fully covered by producers, as well as the costs for running the PRO, for the administration of the organization, for reporting to the government and for communicating to the consumers. And these costs, they can be offset with potential revenues from the sale of recovered materials. So here again, there is a built-in incentive for producers to seek quality, because the better the quality, the more value they can get on the market for those collected materials. and this can help them reduce their contributions into the system. So such structure, as described here, ensures that the funding is dedicated specifically for waste management activities. It is ongoing because it is linked to the amounts placed on the market. So there are constantly amounts being placed on the market. And the funding is sufficient because it is underpinned by legislation, and the money that is collected stays in the system and is used to improve the infrastructure and the performance. So that's the role of the producer and also the other players who are involved in the system.
And there are a lot of players, as we can see here. So I could imagine that transparency would be key in making this system work. How do we tackle that?
Thank you, me too. I also just want to give a reminder to folks, we're nearing the end. So if you do have questions, now's a good time to get those in. Thank you. Yes, so last but not least in the principles, we have number 5, system integrity. So this principle of system integrity is really to ensure that we have a system that is stable, that's well functioning, and that's trustworthy at the end of the day. And for that, government plays a key role. So we saw this on Biljana's slide before, and now let's just dive in a little bit more. So the government's role here really is that they need to set the clear framework. This provides a level playing field for everyone, so everyone's playing by the same rules. And it also gives the framework for producers to comply with all of the obligations that are set out for them. High-performing EPR systems, we see, they balance government oversight with industry-driven management. So we, of course, need both those stakeholders. They're key in this, but they both need to be involved, and there needs to be a balance. But at the end of the day, the government oversight is critical. Some more about the actual role of the government and what they're doing in EPR. They establish specific monitoring, control, and enforcement procedures. And this is to make sure that producers take that responsibility seriously, to make sure there's money in the system, investments into infrastructure and technology. And this is all, at the end of the day, to set up a system that those targets can be achieved. So to recap, this is a summary of the 5 principles and the elements that we just reviewed for EPR for consumer packaging. So circularity, performance, convenience, producer responsibility, and system integrity. I hope that you all could now see how extremely important it is to get EPR right for balancing the economics of recycling and for achieving real environmental outcomes. This is a snapshot of some of our white papers. The one that we're speaking about today, the white paper on EPR for packaging, is the second in our white paper series on EPR. The first one in 2021 focused on deposit return systems for beverage containers. And we have a number of other white papers. They can all be accessed online. You can use the QR code here. And we have a couple more lined up for this year as well. Specifically, there should be one on advanced recycling and recycled content you'll probably find extremely relevant, as that's getting a lot of attention right now. And here's a link where you can find all those resources. We'll have the white paper there. We have a number of podcasts already live on circularity and EPR and other related topics, and there will be more coming throughout the year. Also for videos, we'll have a couple different short form videos explaining EPR and our perspective on EPR, so please check those out as well. And yeah, just like to thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, we do have the official launch is tomorrow, and we are holding a global launch webcast. And it will be moderated by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So if you'd like, you could also tune into that. It will largely be the same content, but there could be some additional focus. So now I'll turn it over to the rest of the team and we'll go through some Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Biljana, for a very insightful presentation on EPR, a complicated subject that you've managed to break down in about half an hour. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think we can just dig right into the questions. Sarah, I think this one came in actually when you were talking about targets. Can you tell us a little bit more about efforts underway around the world on setting targets?
Sure. So yeah, there's a lot of activity right now on targets in general, and specifically, as I just said at the end about recycled content. In Canada, they have set an ambitious goal to have, let me get this right, 50% by 2030 at the federal level. So they're still in the kind of more initial stages, but they're figuring out how they will, effectively design a system to reach that target. There's an interesting report that came out in the past couple months. Also in the US, as part of our Save Our Seas Act, which I think was last year, there's research being done into what recycled content targets could look like in the US. What does the capacity look like? Where are the issues, the blockades, the opportunities? So that's at the federal level in the US. In the state of New Jersey, they just passed earlier this year a suite of comprehensive recycled content targets that cover a variety of materials. They scale up over time. So that really will probably have a big impact in the states, and other states are looking at that of how they might adapt it and implement it. The EU is also undergoing revisions and adapting new ways of recycled content targets. They already have one for beverage containers, but it will be expanded to be more comprehensive. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the hot topics for targets and recycled content right now.
Okay, thanks. Second question, how can EPR be flexible and adapt to new types of packaging and other system level changes? And I think this one's really an interesting one. Liana, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So how can EPR be flexible? Well, what we are finding is that EPR is extremely flexible. As Sarah explained in the beginning, the principle can be applied to all kinds of products, ranging from electronics to mattresses to packaging. So of course, within the category of packaging, it can apply to different kinds of packaging, innovative or not. And we have seen this light as well with the differentiation between beverage containers, which require a special approach to be addressed, and deposit return systems are the best EPR approach for those kind of packaging. But really for all the rest, it's what we have described. As long as these 5 principles they're being followed, that the programs can be flexible and accommodate different types of packaging, as long as we ensure that the financing is there, the systems to collect, to sort, to recycle packaging are there, guided by target setting legislation, that the stakeholders are aligned. It can be extremely flexible.
Okay, and let's stick with that just for a moment, the financing, because it's the next question. I know you tried to take us through it with the PRL slide, but that is complicated. How is an EPR system funded exactly?
Yeah, so starting maybe again with that slide, we have the legislator which sets what costs exactly need to be covered by producers, and usually this happens in the legislation with a specific guidance document, etc. And we know the international standard there is collection, sorting, recycling, plus communication to the citizens, because this is necessary to get the quantity and the quality of materials. The reporting done by the PROs, done by the producers, and the controls and enforcement mechanisms that are in place. So once we have that, then there is a calculation based on what those costs are and how those costs need to be attributed to producers. We have also the eco design considerations coming into the picture, so that the packaging which has associated higher costs, so packaging which is more difficult to collect, to sort, to recycle, this kind of packaging has to contribute more to the system, whereas more recyclable packaging has to contribute less. And then producers, whenever they are placing something on the market, then based on the amounts they're placing and again the type of packaging, they have to contribute to the PRO, and the PRO enters into different contracts with municipalities, with private waste management companies, with recyclers, etc., to use the money from the pot from the producers to finance those activities. And they usually also collaborate with municipalities, with local authorities on the communication part to the consumers.
Okay, so again, very complicated system. For those of you or those of us who still are having a bit of trouble, please reach out to Biliana or Sarah. I'm sure they'll be happy to walk you through that again. So you showed us 5 principles, you and Sarah. How exactly did you come up with this list of principles and elements? I think the principles, we didn't go through the elements. Yeah.
Maybe I can take this one. I think me too, in the beginning, you were quite modest when presenting TOMRA, but actually TOMRA is the global leader in providing solutions for both types of EPR for packaging that we have seen. We are leading on the market for reverse vending solutions for deposit return systems, and also for sorting equipment for EPR for consumer packaging. And this we've been doing for 50 years already in more than 40 countries globally. So we see things that work and things that do not work well in those countries with EPR systems. But also our expertise goes beyond the technology. So we are applying systems thinking to everything we do. We are collaborating with partners along the entire packaging value chain to provide sustainable solutions. And based on this experience that we've had, we have come up with those. We have identified with what works, what doesn't work, and we have come up with those principles and trickle down to the elements.
So those 5 principles, regardless of where you are in the world, regardless of what the situation is, they need to all be somehow evident in any successful EPR system, right?
Exactly. This is the framework, the basic framework that need to be respected. And again, every context is different. So the exact implementation might be different, or the process to get there, but these are really the key.
Okay.
And just to kind of add on there, I think we mentioned briefly today, but there's definitely more about it in the paper, this idea of adapting to the local context. I think most anyone who's tuned in today probably has some understanding and familiarity with waste management in your area, if not around the world, and how it's so different everywhere you go. And ideally, I mean, part of the point we're doing this today and talking about that is the more harmonized or standardized the policies and the systems are, in many ways, it's much easier. We can be more effective, more streamlined. But then, of course, the reality is we're going to have to adapt to local context. So in the paper, that's what we really tried to address. For example, the informal sector, there's some places that might not be as important. In some places, it's extremely critical that you're really bringing them in as an equal stakeholder. So that's one example. I'd say equity in general, and that gets addressed differently in different locations where these facilities being built, making sure the public's brought in local groups and NGOs so that everyone has a voice in designing these systems. And last on that too, for the local context, when we talk about access and ease of use, I think that there's a lot of variation there with local regional variations. If a certain place has nothing set up yet, you can really kind of come in and almost leapfrog and start up with the latest and greatest. Whereas some places might in general be more advanced, but they kind of have this legacy infrastructure that we do have to work with. No one wants to just shut all that infrastructure and systems that have been adapted and start anew. It's not feasible. So how do we work with existing infrastructure and assets and go from there? So there's a lot of different ways that EPR has been implemented. And like I said in the paper, we really go into some of these different examples.
Okay, so the EPR is not a one size fits all, but these principles do need to be in all of them in some fashion. Okay. Sarah, if you can just stay with us for a moment. What role do quality and quantity play in EPR and in achieving circularity?
Yeah, so Yeah, so this comes back largely to the targets discussion, I'd say. Quantity and quality for me, we're talking about, this comes back to kind of the economics of recycling and how, in general, we can say it's been pretty imbalanced in most places around the world. And we've really seen that now with the Chinese sword, how it's disrupted things and has forced regions, places to find more local solutions, domestic end markets, ideally, for processing these materials. In order to have these end markets that are thriving, there has to be an emphasis on quality. So previously, maybe there wasn't the need to have an emphasis on quality. There were some end markets that were processing them in some capacity, but whether they were actually being returned to new products as recycled content, I don't think that was necessarily the case as much. So now we have this opportunity with this disruption in the system globally to really bring in new ways of thinking, kind of a paradigm shift. People talk about the circular economy and circularity, and that's where quality and quantity come in. We need to start with quantity. We need that material in the system first and foremost. We need good collection systems to make sure we're bringing in just that volume that we can then sort it into new products with high quality systems, technology, people with the skill sets to understand how to make the systems evolve over time as well. And at the end of the day, we need high quality systems so that the product that we're getting, the output of that system, can go back in and meet the specifications of a new product. Food grade, whether it's a high value application like food grade, which has extremely high quality specifications, we need to make sure we're emphasizing both sides of that equation when we set this up.
And you just addressed something, we need to get to the material. So the next question here, could you please tell us more on how EPR might impact the value chain, specifically in downstream or waste management?
Sure. And again, this is one that really will vary quite widely depending on the region. In general, for a lot of folks, I'd say municipalities are the stakeholder that is responsible for waste management, at least in some capacity, if not the entire system. However, in places where there's more of a private ownership of the system or operation of the system, there's a lot of different things to consider. It's extremely complicated. And again, we do go into further detail on this in the paper, so please check that out and get back to us with questions on some of those specifics. But I think to point out here that, it's obvious there will be a big transition. I don't think anyone would say EPR is simple. It's complicated, but for good reason, because we're trying to get good outcomes from this, both environmentally and rebalancing these economics. So a lot of thought has to go into it, a lot of stakeholders, but that transition period, especially, this is why, we talk about collaboration throughout the value chain, bringing people in early on. So we're considering all the different impacts and finding the best solution. And, some of these contracts will have to be renegotiated and changed, but at the end of the day, more supply will come into the system. If we have these targets set in legislation, they're ambitious, they stagger, that's all driving change, and it all should be positive impact for stakeholders in that part of the value chain. But yes, there will be some transition that we'll all have to adapt to.
And also positive effect, of course, for the environment and the climate.
Exactly.
We don't want to forget that. We do have one last question. So for those of you who are online and attending, I would like to invite you if you would like to ask a question, please get that question in. Otherwise, we have one last question. And Sarah or Biliana, I'm not sure who wants to field this. Speaking to convenience, what approaches are you finding works best from the consumer standpoint for convenience when it comes to packaging recycling? And it's a two-part question. Do you want to answer that part first?
Yes.
Okay.
I was just trying to see whether there is a link with the second part of the question. But so what works best from the consumer standpoint is what Sarah was talking about. So access, we need to consider the access. How far do consumers have to travel when they want to dispose of something? And also the convenience, the ease of use, what is required of them, whether they have to separate their materials into many different fractions, and they're standing in front of the bin and wondering, okay, where does this go? Or can they just throw it in one or two bins, and then further processes like automated sorting will do the rest? I think these are the key elements that need to be considered. And again, it will depend on the context. It will be different if we are talking about a large city, urban area, or a rural, more remote area. The criteria will be different.
And maybe that actually leads into the second part of this. How do you go about starting EPR discussions in areas without even a curbside recycling program in place? So I guess we're talking more about the informal management systems that are out there. How do you implement or start these discussions?
Yeah, for each context, you need to consider what is out there already and try to build as much as possible on what is out there. So have the targets, have the vision of where we want to go, but use as much as possible what is there already, what has been set up. So in the case where I don't know what this person was imagining with the question, but in case we are talking about the context with only informal economy, with only informal sector and nothing else, then we need to first look at how to integrate that sector in the system, so that the work they are delivering, the service they are contributing to the society, to the environment, that it is also rewarded properly and it is used to a good cause for the system. When I heard this question for the first time, I was thinking that we usually say that the deposit return system, the beverage containers, are the low-hanging fruits that we normally start in a geography. Ideally, the two go hand in hand, GRS together with EPR for consumer packaging, but generally GRS is just a low-hanging fruit that is already happening even in those geographies with informal sector and nothing else.
So to sum it up, Liliana, would it be fair to say we need EPR and there's always a place for it, always room for it in any given system, or even where there's no system in place?
Definitely, and that's also what the experience shows. We have seen the maps from the beginning with the global trends. We have seen how massively EPR has expanded, and this is not by chance. It's really goes with proven results when we get it right.
And that's what the 5 elements are for. So very good. Okay, with that, I think we can close the Q&A session. Perhaps Liliana, Sarah, you have some last thoughts on EPR.
I'll start, sure. Yeah, I think, first of all, honestly, I think it's a very exciting topic right now, even if, it can sound boring because we're just talking about waste. There's a lot of people who are really engaged in this that maybe weren't a couple years ago. So there's really a bit of a tide shift throughout the value chain and different stakeholders seeing, okay, maybe this is an opportunity. Of course, there's challenges with it, but if we don't have some kind of paradigm shift, like I mentioned, we're not in a good place. So something has to change, and I think EPR is the tested way of how we can bring that change in. We need more money in the system to have better technology and infrastructure to process these materials. The streams of materials are extremely complicated in their shapes, their sizes, how many layers they have, and we want to be processing that in a good way and bring it back into the system. So I'm excited to see what can happen in different areas around the world and how different places adapt and implement it in different ways. I think there's a lot to continue to learn. And yeah, I think on a personal level, I guess the whole waste hierarchy, that structure is, again, exciting and has a lot of opportunity. How do we move even higher up that framework? And first, before we even talk about recycling, how do we get waste out of the system? Are there opportunities for reuse? So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how that adapts.
Great. Liliana?
Yes, on my side, to confirm what Sari is saying, that EPR as a principle is a very simple, in fact, idea that producers get responsible for what they are placing on the market, and this should provide them the incentives to rethink everything from the very beginning, so that at the end it's easier to handle, to manage. But indeed, when we get to the implementation, this is where it gets complicated. And we at TOMRA, with our expertise, with our experience, we're happy to get engaged in constructive discussions and to collaborate together to see how to get those systems right so that they deliver the full potential that EPR has.
Good. Thank you very much, Liliana. Sarah, once again, very interesting and insightful presentation. And thanks to all of you who attended today. We understand there were some technical issues getting into this session, and we really sincerely apologize for that. The session has been recorded, and you will receive a link today or tomorrow so that you can take a look at your convenience. And if you have any questions, of course, reach out. We do hope that your time was well spent, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next TOMRA Talks Roundtable. Thank you and goodbye.